Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit public network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale up. And for your tasks that need fast computations, such as training machine learning models and running your CI/CD pipelines, they just launched dedicated CPU instances. And they've also got worldwide data centers, including a new one in Toronto and one opening in Mumbai at the end of the year. So go to pythonpodcast.com/Linode, that's Linode today, to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season, we have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Dataversity, and the Open Data Science Conference, with upcoming events including the O'Reilly AI Conference, the Strata Data Conference, and the combined events of the Data Architecture Summit and Graph Forum. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences to learn more and take advantage of our partner discounts when you register. Your host as usual is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Nicole Harris and William Woodruff about the work they are doing on the PyPI service to improve the security and utility of the package repository that we all rely on. So Nicole, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Nicole Harris. I've been working on PyPI, or the Warehouse project, which is the code base that powers PyPI, for about 3 or 4 years now. In my day job, I manage a UX UI team at a company called PeopleDoc, but in my spare time, I work on PyPI.
And William, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is William Woodruff. I'm a security engineer with a small security consultancy called Trail of Bits. I've actually been working on Warehouse for only about 5 or 6 months now. We started the work back in March. But during my day job, I sort of split my time between engineering and research. And on the research side, I do program analysis research, mostly government funded. And on the engineering side, I work on mostly open source projects like Warehouse and OS Query and things like that.
And going back to you, Nicole, do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
So my background is in HTML, CSS, design, user interface. So Python wasn't sort of the first technology that I was exposed to in terms of the web, but my husband is actually a Python developer. He started teaching himself programming by learning Django. So through him, basically, I got introduced to Python and also learned, enough Python to be useful alongside my front end skills.
And William, do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
I think I used Python in a few university courses, but I didn't actually really start programming in earnest in it until I took this job. And before that, I mostly did actually C and Ruby. So this has been sort of a nice turn for me.
And given the fact that you haven't been using it for your day-to-day, I'm curious how much effort it's been to get up to speed with the code base and be able to understand it and be effective with it, and how much of your experience with Ruby in particular was able to easily translate.
So I think fortunately, the Warehouse code base, I'd like to say, is probably one of the nicest Python code bases I've worked on. It has like 100% unit test coverage, and the idioms of the frameworks that it uses are actually well preserved across the code base. So it was actually relatively easy to get up to speed. And thankfully, I had both Nicole and everybody over on the PSF side, as well as Sumana at Chainset, to answer my questions as they came up.
And so for both of you, I'm wondering if you can just start by sharing a bit about how you each got involved in working on the PyPI project and the main responsibilities that you have.
Yeah, so I can maybe start there. So I think it must have been in 2015, Donald Stuft, who is the lead developer on Warehouse, which is the project powering PyPI, sent out, I think he actually opened a GitHub ticket that said, "Help, I need a designer. This is not something that I'm good at. I'm rebuilding this thing and, this is completely outside of my skill set. So, please retweet." And it was through one of my friends that I'd actually met at a Python conference that I kind of put my hand up and said, "Hi, I'm Nicole, and this is what I do, and I think I can help you." So So that's how I got involved, and my involvement has kind of extended from there. So in terms of my responsibilities, I'm responsible for the UX, the UI, so the user experience, the user interface, as well as the HTML and the CSS code base for the warehouse project. So a bit of both, a bit of coding and a bit of designing.
And William, how about yourself?
Yeah, so on my side, I got involved via the current contract that I'm working on, which is the OTF-funded security improvements to Warehouse. And my work has primarily revolved around 4 key changes to the Warehouse code base to sort of improve both the way that users improve the ability for users to secure their accounts, as well as improve the general security posture of the PyPI code base. And I can talk about the specifics of those improvements as we go forward, but that was how I got started.
And particularly for you, Nicole, what was the state of the system at the time that you first began working on it, and any of the notable issues that you were first faced with?
So I don't know if you're aware of the sort of full history of PyPI. When I joined the project in, I think it was 2015, 2016, basically PyPI.org was still powered by an old code base that had been written, like, I think it had been written before kind of web frameworks even existed. I think Donald described it as before we even knew how to like use Python to build great web experiences. So in terms of the state of the ecosystem, there was this old code base that I was kind of that Donald really discouraged me from diving into. He was like, look, don't look at it. It's not best practice. What we're going to do is we're going to rebuild this from scratch. So, I had a fairly clean slate in terms of the user interface and, in fact, the HTML and the CSS code base. Donald did have some sort of, I think they were bootstrap templates that were working in the code base, but they weren't particularly finessed, let's say. They were basically just kind of outputting data onto the screen. So I basically rebuilt that from scratch and made a whole lot of decisions about how we were going to structure, not so much the templates, but certainly the SCSS, because we're using SAS, the SCSS code base, so that it would be something that would be easy to maintain moving forward. Because if any of your listeners have experience sort of working on large code bases with CSS, it can get out of control pretty quickly. So we needed to put that in from the beginning.
So as I started working on Warehouse, one of the first things I looked at was sort of the present security posture of the site and of the various like sort of common weak points in package management, such as like name squatting or project name reuse or username reuse. And overall, as far as package managers or package indices go, Warehouse was in a pretty good state. So, for example, as I began work, it already supported preventing common typo squatting attacks on packages. And it had rate limiters and other sort of mechanisms in place to prevent these really common low-level attacks against package indices. The things that I ended up working on as part of the OTF-funded scope were things that are sort of above and beyond the current norm for package indices, and that would be like two-factor authentication, API tokens. Surprisingly, are not the norm for package indices, and the audit logging infrastructure.
And Will, I understand that you have also worked on the Homebrew package manager as well, and I'm wondering what your initial reactions were as you started digging into Warehouse and how it compared to your prior experience of working with other package managers and some of the common security pitfalls that are germane to that particular type of application.
Mm-hmm. I will say I am probably the Homebrew's current worst maintainer. I'm probably one of the least active ones, but the security issues that Homebrew has to deal with are unfortunately somewhat orthogonal to the traditional Homebrew or traditional package management issues, primarily because Homebrew revolves around this central Git repository for all packages. And so we actually have finer grained control over both the integrity of packages as well as their origin, because we can actually see the Git committer, as well as run like CI checks basically iteratively as every package gets updated. So it all gets centralized in a way that, for example, PyPI can't necessarily do. But that being said, I think
And so for each of you, once you began working on the PyPI code base and working toward some of the initial issues, I'm curious if the problems that you were addressing are identified ahead of time, or what your overall approach was for determining what were the most critical and most important tasks to be undertaking to improve the overall security and user experience of the platform.
Yeah, so I can take this one. I think this kind of relates to the way that that this project has actually been funded. So, as well as being a contributing designer slash developer on PyPI, I'm also a member of the Python Packaging Working Group, which is the sort of sub organization or a working group that works under the Python Software Foundation to raise money for packaging related projects. And it was through that working group that we actually got funding to make the security improvements that the users are starting to see being rolled out on PyPI. So the scope of the work that Will and I have been undertaking is directly related to the application that we made to the Open Technology Fund, who have actually funded this work. So what we did is we looked at their mission and their vision and their values. We looked at the different grants streams, and we made an application for the items that we thought were relevant to their particular fund. And that was kind of what determined the scope of everything that has been funded through that particular initiative. So I think, Will, you probably agree that in coming into this project, we had fairly well-defined parameters around what was and what wasn't in scope based on what was basically being funded and what we'd said we were going to do for the OTF.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think, yeah, we had a high-level idea of the individual goals we wanted to achieve based on the work that we scoped out with OTF. And then once we actually began work, we sort of prioritized the individual tasks based on what we thought would have both the highest user impact as well as what we could roll out with like minimal disruption to like package upload and the user experience.
And given that you're both focusing on somewhat different areas of the platform, I'm wondering how often the issues that you're focusing on have had overlap and what the cross-section ends up being between user experience and security, particularly given that the interfaces that you're dealing with aren't necessarily just the web UI that you see when you load up the web page.
So I'm of the opinion that UI is severely underrated in terms of user security. So users oftentimes don't really know how to engage with the security features that security engineers expose to them, and this is an issue that I've run into in other platforms that I've worked on. And I think a huge boon to working with Nicole has been actually setting up a set of features and then seeing how to expose them correctly to users. So that's something that I'm not personally equipped to do. And seeing her build like this actually extremely pleasant to use and extremely intuitive setup has been really great.
And then in terms of the trade-offs that exist, I know that oftentimes there's a conflict between improving the overall security of a system, but also still making it usable, because as you ratchet down too tightly on making something ultimately secure, you start to encourage people to take shortcuts that ultimately reduces the effectiveness of your practices. And how you try to balance that issue and some of the common patterns that you have settled on to make sure that you're improving the security as much as is possible while still making sure that people are adhering by those security practices.
Yeah, I think a huge challenge when designing secure systems is security fatigue. So one of the last things you want to do is, like you said, ratchet down the system so much that users become frustrated and take shortcuts to achieve their ends. And that's one of the issues you often see with like two-factor implementations is a two-factor implementation will like require a user to sign on or re-authenticate so frequently that users will just like move their TOTP setup onto their host itself and just Control-C, Control-V, and thereby like dissolve the second factor component of the authentication scheme.
And I'm wondering too if you can just enumerate the overall list of interfaces and the total surface area of the problems that you're each working with as far as the specifics of the PyPI project, because with some projects it might be limited to just the web UI, others it might be just an API, But with PyPI, there's the web interface, there are the APIs that users are using, there's the actual data integrity, as well as the actual interactions that people have of downloading and installing the packages, which is potentially another attack vector that isn't necessarily going to be present in other projects.
Yeah, I think so. The work that, at least what I did, the work that I did, primarily centered around the API and the web interface. So the security features that we added, specifically two-factor authentication, API tokens, and an audit log of those. Two-factor authentication is intended primarily for use with the web interface, and audit log visibility is performed via the web interface. Although some audit log events are actually captured as the user hits the API for like security sensitive actions such as package uploads or file uploads or removals. But also on the API side, there's API tokens themselves, which the user will interact with via a tool like Setup Tools or Twine or any of the other clients that interact with the warehouse API.
And Nicole, for you as well, I'm wondering what the surface area is that you're dealing with as far as the user experience work and some of the ways that that manifests at the different trade-offs in the interactions between APIs and web UI and the overall package upload experience, etc.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of this current contract, my work has been limited to basically what Will just described. So, first part was making sure that when users that they find it easy to set up two-factor authentication and then to use that when logging into pypi.org. So that's sort of the first thing we worked on. Then we looked at the API keys. API tokens. We're avoiding the word keys, and I can tell you why later. Looking at how it's making it easy for users to set up those tokens, and then obviously, as Will said as well, exposing the audit log to the end users. In terms of my work with regards to sort of the way that people interact with PyPI outside the browser, that's really limited to me making sure that the instructional text and the help text that we're showing on pypi.org is actually useful enough for people to be able to do what they need to do. So, for example, with the API tokens that we've just deployed, I've been running some user tests that have revealed that perhaps the way that we display the token and the instructions that we give to users currently is not good enough for them to understand what they need to do next using whatever tool they're using. So that's kind of where my sphere of influence kind of sits, is making sure that people have the information that they need to be able to then interact with PyPI however they need to do that.
That I'm sure is also complicated by the fact that there are any number of different tools that people might be using that would require the access to that API token, where I know that there's pip and there's Twine for being able to upload things, and Flit, and there are, I'm sure, any number of different homegrown applications. And I'm wondering how that plays into your efforts to make sure that the instructions are clear and accessible, and I guess how far you're willing to take the effort and when you decide that you've covered enough ground and the sort of majority of people are handled, and anybody who is in some of these edge cases is there because of something that they've decided to do that isn't necessarily something that would be required to be supported by the people responsible for the PyPI infrastructure.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two factors when thinking about, or at least how I think about designing for PyPI. It's that, yeah, people have different workflows, as you've just described, and also that you have people with different, really vastly different levels of knowledge as well. So, Python is now being used a lot as a teaching language. So I'm really aware that PyPI could be the first package index that some people are using or experiencing. So they might not be familiar with all of the concepts that we present to them. On the flip side, you have people who've been coding for, decades and are really familiar with all the concepts. So it's a real challenge in terms of making sure that you're explaining things enough for beginners whilst also not sort of talking down to people who are really experienced. So that is a challenge. I tend to lean on the side of, okay, let's give more information for beginners, because at the end of the day, experienced users can ignore instructions that they already know if they don't need them. In terms of the kind of weighing up how much information to give, we tend to take a lot of feedback from the community. So, I mean, I've run user tests. I'm thinking less about the API tokens here and more about the two-factor authentication workflow that we worked on. I ran a whole lot of user tests when we were rolling out those interfaces with people with different levels of experience and who were kind of using different tools. For example, for TOTP to authenticate, some people were using a password manager to create a temporary one-time password. Some people were using a mobile phone. They were using Authy. Other people, there was all sorts of different ways that people were doing that. And what we in the end did was put a whole lot of examples into our help text of okay, these are the kind of applications that you might choose to use. And we made sure that we had a good balance there between, sort of the most popular tools. So things like Google Authenticator and Authy sort of floated to the top of the list as things that people sort of were mentioning frequently, but also mentioning the less common use cases, making sure, for example, that we were listing non-proprietary solutions as well, because we know that there's members of the community out there who prefer not to use proprietary software. So it's really just about prioritizing the way that you present the information to cover the most common use case first, and then give the information for the edge cases later. Yeah, and I would say that's the same also when we're talking about WebAuthn, which is two-factor authentication with some kind of device. Lots of people understand that as, I authenticate with a YubiKey, because YubiKey is probably the most popular USB key that you can use with that particular standard. But we do have people out there in the community who are using other things. So what we ended up doing was writing the instructional and the help text in such a way to sort of emphasize USB keys, mentioning certain brand names, so people kind of were associating what we were talking about with the correct concept, and then also mentioning, hey, there's all these other ways that you can also do this as well, by the way. So I think that balance is quite good, because generally, if you are not necessarily using the most mainstream, as you sort of said, if you're not using the most mainstream solution out there on the market, then you're probably more familiar and a more advanced user anyway, in which case perhaps the help text or the instructional text is less required for you than it might be for someone who's a beginner who's using something that's fairly mainstream.
Yeah, and to add on to that, for the API tokens work we did, one thing that's pretty interesting about the Python package ecosystem as a whole is that there's a whole lot of third-party clients out there and a whole lot of third-party implementations that talk to these APIs. And so as we were designing out the initial API keys approach, we realized that we would probably have to make concessions in terms of like authentication semantics to make them fit into all of these third-party clients that expect a username and a password instead of just a general purpose key for authentication. And as we were working on that, we also realized very quickly that the range in continuous integration setups, as well as other automated systems, constrained our ability to add certain token prefixes and certain stub usernames. So doing all of that work was pretty interesting, because it involved community feedback, as well as trying to sort of guess at the common or happy paths and unhappy paths for common uses of tokens, or API keys.
One thing I'd also like to add to that is, I don't know when this podcast exactly is going to go out, but currently in terms of those API tokens, I'm still working on improving the help text and the instructional text. But I do need to seek feedback from members of the community as to what tools they are using their API tokens with, so that I can make sure that I am covering all of those, well, as many of those use cases as possible within the help and instructional text. So I suppose that's a bit of a call to action. And I know we'll probably get a chance to make another one by the end of this podcast. But if you're a community member out there and I'm particularly interested in if you're using a continuous integration service to upload your package to PyPI and you'd like to test out the API tokens, then I'd really like to speak to you, because understanding what your workflow is and how we can document that in the user interface and give brief but useful instructions would be very valuable.
As we've been discussing here, there is a wide variety of people and patterns in terms of how the PyPI infrastructure is interacted with, and I'm curious how that informs and affects your overall workflow and strategy for introducing changes to the platform, and how you validate and, I guess, control the rollout of those changes.
Yeah, so I can speak on that a little bit. So in terms of releasing new features, well, a lot of this is actually handled by Sumana from Chainset Consulting, who's our project manager for this contract. And she's worked as a project manager for previous contracts as well. And what she does is she reaches out to the community and does a lot of communication about what the upcoming features are going to be. We then, when we release a new feature, it's marked as a beta or beta, depending on your accent, feature. So it sort of comes with the warning of, this is something that we've shipped, but, it's still not kind of certified as perfect and production ready. So, obviously set things up with the expectation that perhaps things might change. And she does communication at that point as well to reach out to the community to say, hey, we've released this new thing, please go and test it. At that stage, I obviously also do some reach out in terms of user testing with people to see if they've got any problems working through the interfaces. But we also, because of her work in sort of communicating what's going on to the wider community, we do tend to get a lot of tickets opened up on GitHub where people have said, hey, I've tried out this thing and it's not quite working. There's a bug, or I'm using a browser that you haven't tested it with, or whatever it is. And then we go and address those particular issues before we can obviously move out of the beta period. So it's been quite smooth so far in terms of, there's bugs, but we expect that to happen within that period. And we've been quite good at turning around and fixing those. And because we're labeling things as beta, people understand that's part of the process of developing software. Will, did you want to comment on that at all in terms of some of the changes maybe that we've had to make based on feedback that's come back from the community?
Yeah. So I think the big things that come to mind are what you mentioned earlier with confusion about token versus key in the context of security token versus what I originally called API tokens, but we quickly realized confuses users because they associate token with a physical device. We've also, on more of the development side, I think I mentioned earlier, but Warehouse has pretty comprehensive unit tests. So as we've been developing, we've been somewhat fortunate to catch things that otherwise probably would have blown up in production, as both unit tests and as smoke tests via either Sumana or the reviewers on the PSF side. That would be Ernest, Donald, and Dustin.
So we've mentioned the API keys and some of the two-factor auth features that have been introduced. I'm curious, what have been some of the other notable features or improvements that you've each been involved with?
Well, I suppose I've been involved since very early, so I'm going to scope my answer to that question to this particular contract, which is the OTF contract. So yeah, as you said, two-factor authentication, API token, and then the audit log, which is basically being able to expose. So that with this kind of, from my point of view, there's two sides to that audit log. It's we have an account audit log. So when you log into your PyPI account, you can see, okay, when did I last change my password? when did I set up an API key? When did I enable two-factor authentication, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got that exposed. And then we've also got project audit logs as well. So things that have happened on an individual project. So for example, a new release has been made, or an API key has been created that has permissions on this project. So things like that. The other thing to mention is that the OTF grant doesn't just cover security. When we made the application through the Python Packaging Working Group, we also received funding to improve both the accessibility and the localization of PyPI.org as well. So some of my work, already I'm working on this, but it's going to be my work moving forward as well, is to improve the accessibility of PyPI.org for people who are using assistive technologies. So for example, people who are using screen readers, or people who are limited to just using their keyboard, people who are using high contrast mode, etc. And also we're going to be implementing localization, so making it possible for us to translate at least the interface copy on PyPI.org into local languages, so French, Chinese, whatever community contributions we get for translations. Those things are kind of within the scope of the OTF contract as well. So that's super exciting, because it's not just about thinking about how we can make the site more secure, but also how can we make it more universally accessible for people who have different needs and who are in different communities, Python communities around the world.
And William, in terms of the attack vectors that you have considered for PyPI, I know that you said in general it was in a fairly good security stance as far as already having some capacity for mitigating typo squatting attacks. But I'm wondering if there are some of the other attack vectors that you have looked at, or other things that you're concerned about for PyPI, recognizing that you, not asking you to do any sort of improper disclosure, but just in general, some of the thoughts that you have as far as security and attack vectors for a package repository.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the really common attack vectors that you see on package indices and package managers are sort of those typo squatting, package takeover, phishing-based attacks, where someone will try to take over the account or add themselves as a contributor to a project, and then push up a malicious version of that project that contains, a malware dropper or whatever it needs to be. And like I said, so fortunately, PyPI already had a few pretty good mitigations in place, including for typo squatting and rate limiting to prevent credential brute forcing. There are some things that are sort of already well-known weaknesses in PyPI's setup. Those include sort of the way that roles are currently structured. So at the moment, any account can be added to any project as an owner without that targeted user's consent. So and prior to this audit logging, without a ton of history or logging to designate that change. So there are big issues with sort of transparency in package ownership, as well as transparency in changes in package control. So like it's if you I think I'm actually not positive about this, but I believe currently if you delete your project on PyPI.org, another user can claim that name. And if that happens, you can then imagine a sort of package reuse attack where a popular package gets deleted by an attacker, and then they become in a sense, the legitimate owner because they've actually claimed the project rather than taking it over.
Yeah, that's correct as to my knowledge, Will. However, they can't release any files that have previously been released, if that makes sense. So it would only be new versions moving forward. But you're right in the sense that, yeah, it would be, they would own the package and have the legitimacy of that package name. With regards to your first comment, I know that we do have a pull request in progress, so I'm hoping that we'll be able to address the issue with giving permission to add collaborators soon.
Yeah, there's also the sort of more general problem of active scanning of projects, or rather packages, as they get uploaded. And that's, I think, as far as I know, an unsolved problem in the world of package maintenance. And I don't think that's something that PyPI could fairly be asked to solve.
Will, what do you mean by that? You said active scanning?
Yeah, so imagine scanning for like common indicators of compromise or common indicators that a package is malicious for some fuzzy definition of malicious, because you can imagine like a research package that contains malware samples or what have you.
And particularly given the flexibility of Python and the ability to obfuscate the actual intent of the code, it's definitely a non-trivial and potentially NP-complete problem to be able to actually definitively determine whether or not a package is malicious or has some nefarious intent.
Yeah, this is a problem that some of the most lockdown platforms in the world struggle with. Apple with their App Store struggle with static analysis immensely. So I think it would be completely unreasonable to expect a dynamic language on a community maintained index to solve this problem.
So, in terms of your overall experience of working on and with the PyPI platform and the community of users who rely on it, what have been some of the most interesting or challenging or unexpected aspects of that work?
I can try answering that. So, on my side at least, I've done community management before. Some of it as in my role as a homebrew maintainer, some of it on my own open source projects, as well as the open source work that Trilobits does. But it is different every time, and so especially when dealing with feature changes that affect potentially tens of thousands of people, it can be sort of challenging to get people to see your side of things, especially when it comes to like event logs. So very understandably, users are wary of any sort of feature that records their IP address or records security salient events about their actions. And so it can be difficult to explain to users who don't necessarily see the value of those recordings from a security perspective. It can be difficult to justify those events to them. And coming up with a compromise where we both get actionable, or we're able to record enough information to take action while also preserving their privacy and mitigating their concerns can be a challenge. Especially for countries where GDPR compliance is key.
I think on my side, one of the issues with doing design in the open on open source community projects is that the work is very, very visible. And it is really hard to satisfy everybody. Everybody's using different browsers, everybody has different use cases, and we don't have any full-time resources on looking at the user experience of PyPI. It's just me and the hours that I have either in my spare time when I'm working as a volunteer or as on this contract for my contracted hours. So, it has been challenging to try and satisfy everyone and make everybody happy. That was probably more challenging when we had the transition from the old PyPI.org the old PyPI code base to PyPI.org, when there were a lot of changes, which was disruptive to people's existing workflows. On the other hand, there were a lot of people who were like, yay, PyPI's sort of moved into the modern era and it works on mobile. And so there was kind of two sides to every coin. What I've tried to do in terms of my work with PyPI is make sure that when decisions are made, that they're really backed by either user research or user feedback or by user testing. So, it not just being a case of me saying, well, it's my opinion that it should be like this, and therefore my opinion is most important, but actually being able to show people, hey, I looked into this, I looked at prior art, or I spoke to people within the community, and this is the reason that this decision has been made. And when you actually articulate the reason and you show people that you've thought about this more than just, this is my opinion, then people are really responsive to that. So I think that that's been quite a positive experience for me in interacting with the Python community, who as a whole are a very friendly bunch of people.
In terms of the future work that you either have planned for your existing contract or that you have identified as potential improvements to the platform in general, what do you think are most interesting or most notable? And what are some of the ways that listeners and the broader community can get involved and help out with your efforts and just the overall work needed to keep the PyPI platform healthy and viable for the long run?
Yeah, so I can address that. In terms of the current contract, most of the security work is kind of done now. I mean, there's a few things that we need to wrap up. And as I mentioned, I would really like to talk to anybody who's using CI to upload to PyPI, because that would be really helpful for me in terms of making sure that the interface is working for those use cases. In terms of the rest of this contract, as I mentioned earlier, we have accessibility and localization, which are the last two subjects that we need to address. In terms of accessibility, I've also put a call out recently. I'd really like to talk to any members of the Python community who are interacting with websites using assistive technologies. So if you're a user who's online using a screen reader, I would love to speak to you. Same for if you're someone who's limited to using a keyboard, or if you're using high contrast mode, or if you're using like a very zoomed in version. You're zooming in your browser a lot because of poor eyesight. The reason that I would really like to speak to people who are using the web in those ways is because we're doing an audit against WCAG 2.0 standards, which is kind of the accessibility standard. But just being able to tick the box isn't, in my view, enough. I mean, obviously, we want to check the box and say, yes, we're compliant. But actually being able to test the interface with people who are using assistive technology and seeing that it's working for them in real life with real life use cases is super important as well. So it's not really enough just to check the boxes. We really need to talk to people about how they're using the site as well. And on the localization side, and I think there'll be more communication that will come out about this later as we sort of get into that milestone, we are going to be looking for people to help us to actually translate the interface copy into different languages. So once we've actually got the technical implementation done, we're going to want to get people to translate it into whatever language that they'd like to translate it into, barring Arabic and Hebrew and any right to left languages, because that is outside of scope of the current project.
Yeah. Also, on the security side of things, there are things that are out of scope of the current contract, but that I believe are planned for future iteration on the warehouse code base. And that would be things like for API keys, the implementation that we went with is based on these security tokens called macaroons. And one of the interesting things about macaroons is that they have embedded in them something called a caveat language, which allows for a sort of rich description of the permissions associated with each token. And currently, we have a version field in our caveat language that allows for those permissions to be iterated on and modified to allow for sort of really rich interactions with the authentication system. So you can imagine, I think in the future, the plan is to add tokens that expire after exactly one use, or are only allowed between certain hours of the day, or can only be used from a certain domain in terms of, or a certain authenticated IP, or things like that. So I think we've put out on the warehouse issue tracker sort of a request for help with that.
Yeah, I should mention here as well that if any of your listeners are interested in contributing to the warehouse project, the issue tracker is in fairly good, is fairly well managed. So we do tag issues with needs discussion or help required. So going onto the issue tracker and having a look at what discussions are happening is kind of a useful way of being able to find out where you could help make PyPI more sustainable in terms of the feature development that we're currently working on. The other thing I'd like to mention as well is that, and I think what Will's already said today kind of reinforces this, it's a really nice code base to work on. Like, pretty easy to set up with Docker and Docker Compose, got really great unit test coverage. It really is a very nice code base to work on. So, if you're looking to make an open source contribution, I think it's a good candidate. And we do welcome also people who are making their first contribution to open source as well. So it's not just your more experienced listeners who can make contributions to the warehouse code base. We have plenty of tickets tagged with good first issue, which are specifically for people who are looking to make sort of more minor or sort of to ease their way into open source contributions.
Yeah, I do want to hammer that point. It really is a nice code base. I've worked on a lot of both open source and proprietary code bases written in sort of a combination of Python 2 and Python 3, or now Python 3, but we're migrated from Python 2 with very bespoke setups and environments that were clearly developed from an engineer's desk somewhere inside of an office. And Warehouse, fortunately, is not one of those code bases.
And is it worth digging more into the actual funding behind this work and how that's structured and just some of the overall sustainability efforts to be able to maintain and upgrade the PyPI and Warehouse platform?
Yeah, so I can talk about that. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a member of the Python packaging working group, which raises money for not just PyPI, for any packaging related project, and it was through that we got this grant from the Open Technology Fund (OTF) to actually be able to do that work. It's the second major grant that we've got for PyPI. You might be familiar with the fact that we got a MOS. We were granted a MOS grant, a Mozilla Open Source grant last year. Must have been last year, and that was to migrate from the old version of PyPI to the new Warehouse code base and to retire that old code base. So far through the packaging working group, we've had two fairly substantial grants which have allowed us to really improve the packaging index. That working group continues to work to make grants for different subjects, not just PyPI, but also many of the tools that interact with PyPI, such as pip. So we're hoping that in the next sort of year, we will have more money coming in from those applications that we make, and be able to fund more sustainable development for Python, the packaging ecosystem in general. The other thing to mention is that we are very, very fortunate with PyPI to have a number of great sponsors who actually give us their infrastructure for free. I don't have the data right now in terms of how much that's worth, but it's certainly millions per year that it costs to actually run the Python package index. A lot of that is borne by our CDN Fastly, whose donation to us is actually quite enormous. So in terms of sustainability, we have a mixture of these the funding coming through from grant applications, and we have these different companies giving us their services to enable us to keep the service up. The other thing that we appreciate is we have a donation page on pypi.org where members of the community can donate towards the Python packaging working group, so that we can then have a budget to be able to pay for maintenance and improvements to both PyPI and other projects. An ideal scenario in the future is that we would have enough kind of recurring donations from the community that we would be able to set up a more reliable, either part-time or full-time situation where we had people working on packaging as their job, because at the moment we really have mostly just contracts that come and go depending on the money that comes in.
Are there any other aspects of your current efforts on the PyPI infrastructure or any other aspects of the overall platform that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Yeah, I can't think of anything. Can you think of anything, Will?
No, not in particular. There's sort of interesting things about WebAuthn and TOTP that I could go into, but that would be a bit in the weeds.
Well, for anybody who does want to dig deeper into that, if you have any specific references that you have found useful, I can add them to the show notes. And for anyone who wants to follow up with either of you or get in touch and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you each add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week I'm going to choose the show The Expanse. I started watching that recently and have gotten through the first season and into the second, and it's just very interesting and well done sci-fi series chronicling some dramatic events set far into the future where humans have gone beyond Earth and started populating other areas of the solar system. So it's interesting and well put together show with a lot of good sort of environmental aspects, such as the Creole language that people speak further out into the asteroid belt. So if you're looking for something new to watch, I recommend that. And so with that, I'll pass it to you. Do you have any picks this week?
Sure, yeah. I don't know if I have a media pick. I've been reading, I'm not actually normally a big nonfiction person, but I've been reading an autobiography of Abraham Lincoln by Carl Sandburg, who's a somewhat well-known American poet. So it's a little bit out of his, like, I think, not his expertise, but it's a little bit out of his field of renown. But it's been a pretty interesting read so far. It's actually a surprisingly nuanced biography of his life, in the sense that it goes through sort of the both political and military failures that he encountered. And it's been sort of interesting to read, because you learn this stuff in like 10th grade in American high schools, but then it gets dropped.
I do have an answer. Last week or the week before, I watched a documentary on Netflix called The Great Hack, which was particularly interesting to me because I live in the UK, and it talked about Brexit and Cambridge Analytica, and what's sort of been happening. I haven't followed that probably as closely as I should have. So yeah, anybody out there who's kind of interested in documentaries, it's certainly very, very interesting and very topical at the moment with regards to the current political climate.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time today to join me and discuss your work on the PyPI platform and infrastructure, and some of the ways that will improve the overall viability of it in the long term and improve the available workflows for people using it. So I appreciate all of your efforts on that front, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.